Okay, Teresa and Gary. So this recording will hopefully help you see how I would present the poster and give you some ideas for that. And so I'm just going to pretend like I'm actually talking it through. I've got a script. I'll probably go off script a little bit, but yeah, that's what the script is for. So you can ad lib a little bit. All right, so I'm going to get started. All right, thanks for coming by. I would love to talk with you about our poster. You can see here it was on the Christian perspectives of addiction and whether there was any effect on stigma. And so our research project was looking at ways to reduce stigma towards people with addiction. And you've probably heard people talk about mental illness and addiction as a brain disease. And that's often juxtaposed against the moral model, which says that the person is responsible for addiction and so they're to blame for their addiction. And you might assume that the brain disease model would reduce stigma, but it turns out that it's more of a mixed bag. So it does in fact reduce blame. You can say their brain is involved, which is good, which is helpful for stigma, but there's a drawback to the brain disease model, which is that it tends to increase negative stereotypes. So the idea that the person is dangerous and ideas like that. And it tends to make people more pessimistic about whether the person can actually recover. So even this is the main way that we talk about addiction and mental illness, but it actually doesn't seem to be making a positive impact when you compare it to the moral model. So that fact was pretty striking to us and led us to think, what alternatives do we have? And it became apparent that most people have noticed that when they've done research, they've talked about how religion can contribute to stigma. But we were interested in whether there might be some helpful perspectives rooted in Christian religion that might actually be destigmatizing. And we didn't want to just look at these theoretically. We wanted to actually test that empirically. So we wanted to see what effect they might have on the different forms of stigma. So we developed 4 scripts that presented addiction in a particular manner. And we got some input from a theologian as we did that. And we recorded 4 videos. And they range from 90 to 105 seconds long. So they're very short, with an actor portraying a pastor. You could see a picture of the actor here on our poster. And the first video portrayed what we called an individual sin perspective. And this might be kind of like the moral model of sin that really talks about how the person is responsible for their actions and that they should be able to stop themselves from their alcohol or drug use. And the second video was a systemic sin perspective, and it portrayed addiction as a result of systemic evil rather than personal responsibility. And so we talked about how the world is corrupt, how there's poverty, how there's evil in the world, and that leads to sin. So it conceptualizes that the cause of addiction is not individual within the person, it's external to the person. The third video was the brain disease model, and so it was talking about some of the biology of addiction, and of course it was coming from a pastor, so that there's sort of an integration of the Christianity and that biological view. And fourth and last of all, the final video was about a Christian justification for compassion. Why should Christians care about people with addiction? And talked about the idea like, that Jesus cared for people who are marginalized and who are outsiders, and so therefore we should do the same. So we were just curious to find out, do these different perspectives have an impact on stigma? And so in our study, we had 415 Christian participants. It was only for Christians. And we first gave them a vignette of a person with an opioid addiction. And then after that, there's the video. And the pastor claims in the video that he is the pastor to the person in the vignette. And then the participants were actually randomly assigned to only get one of these videos. So there's 4 options, but they're only exposed to one of them. And after they watched the video, we gave them a battery of assessments on stigma, so the different types of stigma. And okay, so given that there was a random assignment, any differences between the groups and what video they watched can really only be attributed to the video. That the video would have to have been the explanation for why there's differences there. So the first thing I'd point out is that the 4 videos, we asked them, how much do you agree with the video? And the one you could see here in figure 1 that they agreed with most was compassion, and just a little bit below that was the biogenetic or the brain disease model. So both of these people liked, they felt like they agreed with them. They felt like when it came from a pastor, they believed it and agreed with it. Lower was actually the individual sin and systemic sin. So even though we had a Christian sample, people didn't tend to agree with these perspectives, and so there's some difference there. And when we dug into it, not all Christians necessarily have the same emphasis on their faith, and so we measured how intrinsically motivated they were in their faith, and we found that overall that the more intrinsically motivated, the more likely they were to agree with the pastor's perspective, regardless of the type. But you can see here that the highest of all these was actually the compassionate perspective, that people were more likely to agree. People who were intrinsically motivated liked the compassionate perspective, felt like it captured something that they perhaps already believed. And then the important question was, do these videos have an impact on the participants' stigma? And so we found with the MANOVA that in fact they did, that the level of stigma was related to which video they were exposed to. And again, they didn't choose these, they were assigned to them, but they differed at the end of it based on which ones they watched. In particular, they differed in their level of social inclusion or willingness to like invite someone with addiction into their social world. And so with the individual sin scoring the lowest there. And they also varied in regards to the amount of compassion they might feel towards people with addiction. So there was evidence that this had an impact. And so the big picture is that pastors can have an impact on stigma. And it seems that they can either be a resource for reducing stigma, but of course they might also be a contributor to it as well. And so we thought that was an important finding. Now lastly, we did some correlational analysis with our findings and asked the question, okay, which of these, if they agree with it, are associated with less stigma? And so the compassionate video, I want to draw your attention to it because the compassionate video really struck us as being promising as an intervention to decrease stigma. So you could see that in figure 5, as agreement with the compassionate video goes up in blue, you can see the level of blaming go down. And then you can also see that as the agreement with the compassionate video goes up, the optimistic prognosis, the idea that, oh, I think that they'll get better, that increased. So so overall, we feel that we have some strong results, and that, of course, more research needs to be done. But the big takeaway is that we think that this study shows that Christian perspectives, while they indeed could have some damaging effects on stigma, there's actually some resources that might be helpful. And in particular, we think that maybe in terms of the public consciousness about addiction, maybe we need to try and from trying to explain what causes it to instead saying, oh, as people, we should be compassionate and caring towards all people, including people with addiction. And so we think there's some broader value to it as well. Do you have any questions about the study? All right. Okay, so I'm going to shut this down, and hopefully it recorded well this time.